Okay, welcome to this lesson on using D3 to create a simple line graph like we have showing here. Um, there's a number of things that are uh, very useful in this lesson. One, we're going to discuss uh, how to create a line path object. So instead of us actually drawing a line from a point to a next point, we're actually going to get D3 to use its line function to create the path for us. And then when we add that path to the page, it'll be as one path object. We're also going to be looking at linear scales, and we're going to be looking at time scales. Also, we'll be looking at creating grid lines and ticks and all of that. So there's a lot to really do in this. We're also going to be importing our data from a CSV file. So instead of us hard coding our data, we're going to start working on looking at importing data. What's really important to understand about this lesson is we need to be running it on a server. In this case here, I've just started up XAMPP, and inside XAMPP I have my data file. Now a CSV file looks something like that. So it's literally a comma separated file, and every new value is done with a return. And you can see that our date and our value is there. Um, when we import that, you're going to see that it's going to import it all as a string. And we're going to have to learn how to convert our strings into data that D3 can scale and understand. But we'll work through that as we go. Um, what I've done here is I have a blank file to start. And from that, we're going to start writing some script. And we're using D3 version 4. And okay, so let's just start here. So what I want to do first is I'm going to use the CSV built-in function with D3. And what we firstly need to tell that file is where it is. And it's in the same folder as our HTML, so it won't be a problem finding its path. What's important to understand here is that when we bring in the data, so we'll just write a very simple function, and there are two outcomes, error or data, and we'll go through this now in detail. If error, throw. Sorry. Okay, so if we are here, there's a built-in error issue that if an error in the import of the file, it will throw an error. So for example, if I was to say this, no, we don't need to show that. Okay, so at the moment here, at the end of our import, we're telling it to console.log data, which is our reference to the data that has come in. So that is equal to that there. So we're saying go get that file. If there's two functions, one if there's an error, we want you to throw error, and the other one is to assign a value of data to the data that we import. So at the moment we're going to console.log that data. So when we bring it in here, we can see that the data is imported. So you can see we have May and we have the close value. Now what's really important to understand here is that both of them are strings. And for that close value to be scalable, it needs to be an actual value. So what we're going to do first is inside the for each, so going to write a for each loop. So we're going to say data dot for each piece of data that we get, I want you to take function of d and I want you to do something to it. So for each piece of data, d, I want you to do something. So in this case, I'm going to say d dot close. So that's the name of the value. Let me just see here now. If we just write console.log, so you can see that each d that we are console, so it's going through the loop, the data loop, and it's saying for each of them I want you to console.log d. So you can see the first one, this object is representing d. So if I now say, well, console.log d dot close, then we are getting each of the values. Now, generally, it's very good at recognizing strings and numbers, but to be sure, what we're going to do here is we're going to say d.close should be equal to, and to make sure that it is an integer or a number, we put the plus sign before it, and that will give us that. So now, when we look inside our array, you can see that this has changed from being red to blue. It did have a inverted commas like this around it. So now that value is recognized as a value by converting it there. The other thing we want to do is we want to say d.date, and we want to what's called parse those dates. Now, before we go up any further, everything that happens within after the data is loaded, this is where we will begin to append our SVGs and so on. Before that, just up here, we may want to write certain functions. So we're going to talk about a function which is known, we're going to call it parse time. So the problem with our time at the moment is it is just recognized as a string, and we need to convert that string into a recognizable time object. So there are built-in D3 functions for parsing time. So it's called time parse. And we need to give it the structure of the data that we are parsing. So if we look at our CSV file, which should be open here, you can see that we're dealing with a day, a month, and a year. So we're telling it that the data we're giving it is in that structure. And it will then convert that into a time, a piece of data that it will recognize as time. So if we see now that if we go to our parse time function, so if I go in here and I write parse time and I place a date in it, written in that format, which is day, month, year, day, month as an abbreviated month, and year, it will give me a correct time. It recognizes this and gives it back as a time object. Okay, so if I change that to 2020, sorry, 20, it gives it back as a Friday, 1st of May, 2020, and it sets the default GMT time as 00. We'll go through, but at the moment, if the data that we're importing is only a string, and for us to use it in scales so that it can understand what time is, we need to parse that time. So if we go back to our data that we're importing, we are then saying take each of the values that are called d.date, and we want you to convert them using our time parse. So we tell it to parse, use the function that we wrote, parse time, and pass d.date in. Okay, so if we didn't convert those pieces, we would be left with a array of data which has a string and another string. By placing in these to say take d.date and change it into a time object, take d.close and change it into an integer value or a float, we're now left with our data that we've imported as a proper time object and a proper value. So that's the first really important part of understanding how we will parse our information into place. Okay, so the next piece that we're going to do is we're going to talk about setting up our margins, and we're going to just talk about how we can declare a variable which has a number of different objects in it. So instead of us just saying top margin, bottom margin, left margin, and creating 4 variables, I'm just going to create one variable called margin, and then I'm going to create a number of values inside it. So if I just say right, I just need to change that into a comma. So now when we do something like this and we go in here, we can now say margin, and it gives us this, and we can then say, well, what's the margin dot top? So it makes it much easier to access the values if they're all wrapped up in one object. We can also declare multiple variables here by saying the width. So in this case here, we're going to make our the width of our graph, not our SVG, will be whatever the width is minus margin dot left, because it's already declared, minus margin dot right. So we're also going to declare our height of our graph, and that will be equal to 500 minus margin dot top minus margin dot bottom. Now, so if I go into margin, we have that. If I say what is our width, we get that. So that's 890. And if we say what is the height, we get 450. So that allows us to change the margins, and it will then work out that our SVG will be 960 in the end, but the width of our actual graph will be that minus those margins first. Okay, now, so it's just a really good singular declaration of saying var, and then we're saying margin, width, and height. So it's much simpler to declare all the variables in one place, and you don't have to keep writing var. Okay, now we've imported our data, we've parsed our data into a readable format, and we've used our parse function up here to recognize that data. So now we're going to look at scales. So we'll work firstly on the y scale. So the y scale, if we look at our graph, is going to be just linear scales. It's just numbers that are scaled up. And we will want our input domain and our output range to be calculated. So our input domain will be whatever the max value is of the y value, which is the close, d.close. So let us just write our scale for the y. So var y is equal to d3 dot scale linear. So we've done one of these before, and what we want to do is we want to tell it the domain, the input domain, and the range. Now it's important to understand that at this point we don't know our domain. We don't know what the input values are. So it hasn't been imported yet. It's only imported after this. So what we'll do here is we'll set up everything else, and later on we'll add our domain to this. So we're going to tell it the range. Now the range goes into an array like this, and we can say, for example, 0, comma height. So that will be, it will output anywhere from 0 to the height of our graph. So in this case, what we want to do is, we don't want it to do it that way, because when we give it a large value, we want it to return, when we give it 0, we want to return a high value, because in the y scale, as such, when we want our 0 down at the bottom, which will mean we will want these values to be moved down the y scale quite a lot. So the lower values will want a higher output. So one of the tricks that we spoke about before was reversing that. So now the output range will be anything from the height of our graph right down to 0. So what we need to do is, later on we will need to write our scale, the part that adds the domain. So if we go here after the data has been loaded, and we tell it what the y dot domain is. Okay, so that is viable like that. So the input domain. So we could say the input domain is anything from 0, and then we want to know what is the maximum value of the d dot dates. Sorry, d dot close values. So we want it to look at the array it's got, and we want it to look at all of the d closes and tell us which is the maximum one. So we will say that we need it to d3, instead of a number here, we want it to look at the values in the array. So we say, using d3.max, we want to pass you the data, which again is a reference to this object, the imported data, and we want it to do a function of d. So look at each one of these values, and then we want you to return d.height, d.date, sorry, d.close. Okay, now so if I type in y, you can see I'm getting the function, but if I type in y12, I get a value, and if I type y 0, I'm getting a bigger value. So remember that our total height is equal to the 500 minus the margin top and bottom. So the top and bottom is 50, so 450 is the max. So when we put in a value of 0, we want the y to be moved down 450. So that seems to be working correctly. Okay. Now we need to work on our scaling of our time. So that happens in the x direction. So if we go in here and we type x, we use the scale time d3 function, and the first thing is to describe what the output range of that scale will be, and we will be moving from 0 to width. So that will be the output range. And the input domain, which will be gathered here, now that the data has been inputted, allows us to say, well, in the x direction, the domain is also going to be a now I'm going to use a new function. Instead of d3.max and d3.min, they return singular values. But we know that within the domain, we have to return an array with, say, 2 values in it. That would be the domain, the input domain. The data, if we just console log data for a second, you can see that data is an array of objects. So you have to tell it which, in that array of objects, which object you're looking at, or which value inside that object you're looking at. So if I want to find out the max of something, I can say d3.max, and inside that I can say data, and we need to tell it which part of that we want to look at. Function d return d.close. Line 31, let me see, d3.max data, function d return.close, and I think we need another one of those. Yeah, so that is telling me the maximum value of a d.close in that whole data set. So there is another function by which we can say the word extent. So what extent does is it returns an array with the minimum and the maximum. So in terms of our date function, we wanted to find out which is the lowest date and the biggest date. So if I was to say return of the extent of date, you can see that we get 26th of March to the 1st of May 2012. So there are 2 dates, min and max. So there's min, max, which will each return 1 answer. And in this case, there's an extent, which will find the min and the max and return it as an array. So in our x scale, we need to tell it what the input domain is. And the input domain is going to be an array, and we just tell it to go and take this and place it in there. So in this case, we are saying the following. So we're saying we want you to look at all of the values that are in date, and we want you to find their extent. So find the min and the max and make that our domain. So now we have our scales ready. We've defined our scale. We couldn't tell it about the domain until the data was imported, and we parsed our data using a time parser and also this, which converts the string into a value, and then we were able to say what the domain of our scales were. So at this point we've also set up our margins, and at this point now we're beginning to be able to append objects. Now, the only other piece we haven't done is written our function for a line. So we're going to do that now, so that when we have all our points and our values, we're able to draw a line. So we'll create a variable, we'll call it value line, and we're going to say we want D3 to use its built-in function for making lines, which is called a D3.line function, and we need to give it some of the values it's going to be getting. So we'll just bring that down there. So the .x value in the line will be a function of D and return D dot date, and the y value of the line will be function D return D dot close. Now, how do we know that is the case? What's important here is that we will be passing this function. We're passing this some data, and that data will be made up of D's, and each D will have a date and a close in it. However, remember, we'll want to use the scaling function at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale the date in the x direction, and I'm going to scale the close value in the y direction, like that. Now, nothing will have happened yet, but when we make an object, we'll be saying use these. So let's go down and let's start creating. This is all of the stuff is wrapped within this import function. So that what that controls is it will not move on to this line until this is complete and there has been no errors. So let's go down here and start with our basic SVG. So we say D3 dot select the body, and append an SVG to it. Sorry, I'm missing that there. So let's stop at this point. Let's have a look. We go into our body, there is an SVG on it. Looks very small because we haven't given it any attributes of height or width. So let's go in here and say dot attribute height. So the attribute of our height of our SVG would be whatever we had set up there as our width, but we'll want to add the margins and the padding. So we can see up here the width is set up as 960 minus our margin left. So that will be the width of the actual graph. The width of the SVG will be 960. So we can just say here width, but if we say width, we've taken away the left and right margins, so we need to add them back on here. So margin dot top. So the width will be margin. Sorry, that should be width. And we'll say width plus margin dot left and margin dot right. Okay, and we'll do the same attribute for height. And we will say it's whatever the height is plus the margin top and the margin bottom. Let's save that and have a look. So you can see our height and width are calculated to be 960 by 500, which are what those original values are. But we'll want the width and height of our actual graph to be less than that. So we've added our SVG. Let's now append a group object inside that SVG, which will contain everything that we need it to contain. And we want to transform this group so we'll just say we want to transform, and we want to use translate, and for the moment I'm just going to put in a value of 200 just to see whether that works. So save, no errors. So that has now been translated 200 pixels. So the SVG is up here in the top left hand corner, and you can see the transformation is object is over here, which is 200 left and 200 down. So how much do we want to translate it by? Instead of hard coding those values, we want to translate it by the margin top, margin left and the margin top. So in the left is this value here. So what we'll do is we will break this up into that plus that plus that and another plus that and another plus that. So we haven't changed anything, we've just concatenated that into a number of pieces so that we can edit it. So what we want to say, instead of 200, we want to say translate the whole group, whatever margin dot left is. And instead of this 200, we want to say margin dot top. So what we're doing here is we're translating that group so that it'll all start here and drawn here. And we'll save that. Okay, so the last piece now we can put this whole unit outside of the import, so it'll be able to create all of that before the data is imported. Nothing has changed there. Okay, just but after the data is imported, we parse it, we set up the domains because now we know the date, and we can append a path. So we declare this variable here, so svg dot append a path object. And the attribute, So let's just leave it there. So there's a path object. Now for a path object to work, you need to have a D equal to, and then you write all your code for that to work. Okay, so how do we do that in here? We say the attribute that we want to affect is D. Now before that, we want to tell it about the data. So, sorry, the data we want to use for our path is called data. And it has been parsed, and it's been updated, and it's called data. So now, when we go in, now it's important we look at why we need to place this around that. When we are, for example, appending a number of objects, so a rectangle, then we want to pass in the loop each D inside our data. But in this case, we want to give the path object all of our data in one go. So you place that in hard brackets when you're doing that. And then in here, we want to say attribute D, and we wanted to use our function, which was called value line, to take all of that data in there and make a line for us. So let's just see whether that is working. Okay, so it is working. The path is there and the fill is shown. Okay. Now what we will want to do is to make sure that that line has no fill. So if I go to this line and I write a style over here and I say fill none and stroke red, you can see that you can change the attributes of that line. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up the top of our page and we're going to write a style, and in there I'm going to write a style for a line. So I'm going to say class line, and I'm going to say fill none and stroke steel blue, and I'm also going to say stroke width 2 pixels. So now all I got to do is I got to add that path, the attribute of class, and the value of line. You can see now that on that path there's a class equal to line, which is now using those styles.